What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 92, and I'm the co-host of the show, Kyle Amslone, joined today by Will Porter. Will, how's it going, buddy?
Kyle, I'm doing great today. How you doing, man?
Doing good. We got a list of stuff to talk about, including the vaccine passport stuff that is a really important issue right now. So I think this will be a great show that we got planned for today. We also got great interviews coming up this week. Got our good friends Connor Freeman and Patrick McFarlane returning to the show, so be sure everybody to subscribe to the show somewhere. YouTube and Odyssey for video versions. It's up everywhere else people could listen to podcasts for audio versions, and that way you don't miss those great interviews. We've also been posting a lot of our content, both what we write. So Will's a staff writer, so he puts out 4 or 5 articles a night. I put out the news roundup. We're putting all that up on all of our social media accounts for the page, Twitter, MeWe, Facebook, and on all those sites we also put up clips for the show, which a lot of people really enjoy. So be sure to check all that out. Will, the last thing I had to plug, of course, is the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeStore.com sells great CBD products, lab tested, so they work for you every time. And they also do great things with their CBD. Like, if you used to go to the head shop, you get a gummy worm, which was, one way to ingest it. But, there's better ways. They combine it with melatonin. That way it really helps you to get to sleep. Or for me, they infuse it in lotions and creams. That way you can rub it on the specific spot that you're feeling pain and get relief. So check out the products at PalomaVerdeStore.com. Be sure to use the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when you check out. That way you let them know that the show sent you, and we get credit for that. But also it gets you a 25% off discount when you spend $75 or more. So again, PalomaVerdeStore.com, promo code PEACE. And of course, the links to everything we talked about here are in the show notes page. Will, let's get into the content and start talking about these vaccine passports, which are pretty Orwellian. I feel like even a year ago, where we're even well within 2 weeks to flatten the curve. That's why we're locking down, right? That was probably 3 weeks from a year ago or something. Even at this point, if me and you were on the show talking about vaccine passports, people would kind of look and do like an eye roll and be like, okay, well, Alex Jones and his buddy over there are blabbering on about ridiculous things, but really we're just trying to do the best we can to try to minimize the number of people who die from COVID. But now we're seriously talking about these vaccine passports, and I guess for most of the vaccine passport advocates I've seen, they're basically just saying you get these little cards when you get your vaccine, and businesses who want to, so if you're a restaurant owner, you could decide that you're going to require people who come into your restaurant to have a vaccine passport and to show their little card at the door, and that's all it is. But I think it's going to be a little bit more nefarious than that. So let's get into it and start talking about this, and why we're going to take a stance against it. So, Will, what's going on with these vaccine passports?
Yeah. I mean, we've been hearing quite a bit about this idea lately. You summarized it pretty well, that they would give you some kind of document or card, or I think more commonly a phone app that somehow proves that you've been vaccinated, and that you would then present that at a business. I think right now a lot of people are talking about event venues and crowded gatherings and stuff. But ultimately, some are calling for these at basically any place where people gather, workplaces and schools and colleges and bars and movie theaters and restaurants and any kind of travel, airplanes and stuff everywhere. Now, at the moment, there are apparently 17 different companies, at least in the US, working on various versions of these passports. And the Biden administration does insist that it will never issue any kind of its own, federal vaccine mandate or anything. However, the government is working to coordinate at least those 17 private projects. And I think the government is a little more involved than Biden's people have been letting on. So last week, we had both the White House press secretary, Jen Psaki, as well as one of Biden's top COVID guys, Andy Slavitt, coming out and really trying to get out in front of this thing. They're really stressing that the federal government is not the one developing these. And they're just offering sort of recommendations. However, there was this report in the Washington Post last week that outlined all the ways the administration is involved in this project, in these projects. And one of the main things that jumped out at me was where they're saying the CDC, the top health agency in the US, will help to determine who is able to issue these passports. They'll kind of act as an accreditation agency and decide which passes are acceptable. So the government is ultimately going to be picking and choosing the players here, who gets to use this thing, which seems to go a bit beyond merely helping to, give recommendations and to organize these projects. A federal agency will basically have the power to like make or break the program. They get to decide who participates. So that kind of jumped out at me as, the federal government is very much involved in this whole project. It's not quite just the private thing they're making it out. And even if it is just private companies developing these apps and passports, state governments have already started to implement them and to sort of adopt them on that level. So New York last week became the first to do that with their Excelsior Pass, which kind of started out in this small experimental basis, but has now been expanded recently to the whole state. And New York's case is very interesting because they don't actually mandate the passes themselves. They don't say anyone has to use these. They say it's voluntary. However, they do require large event venues to prove that attendees have been vaccinated or tested negative for the virus a few days before the event. And, the passes are kind of one way to do that. So I think that's kind of one way they can impose these things on us indirectly, without explicitly passing a law or an executive order that says we have to use these passes. They can kind of regulate it into use without actually directly mandating it. Because for all intents and purposes, the way New York's rules are set up, a lot of these venues basically are forced to use these passports.
Right, and there's a million ways that, especially the federal government, could do this. Well, I mean, everybody knows like a lot of the traffic laws and stuff like that at the state level. The federal government leverages federal dollars through the highway funds to the states to adopt, certain traffic laws that the federal government wants and stuff like that. And so, Biden doesn't have to say you have to have vaccine passports, but as you said, they, pass some regulations that say any state that's maybe getting Obamacare dollars, that could be a possibility or something like that, or, Medicare, Medicaid subsidies, stuff like that. For those states to get those dollars, they have to implement systems that ensure that people going out in public to restaurants and stuff like that are either, again, vaccinated or negative. And so states have to roll out these systems in order to get their federal dollars.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that would actually be very consistent with some of the other things Biden's talked about with his pandemic policy. Like previously, Biden refused to roll out a mask mandate nationally, but he did sort of say, "I'm going to be twisting all these governors' arms to implement the policies that I want them to." So yeah, there's a million ways that the federal government can kind of incentivize and impose itself on the state governments to make them do this. New York, I don't think had to be forced to. I think they just did that on their own accord. Cuomo is in charge over there. Right now, Hawaii is apparently considering a similar idea. I don't think they've gone ahead with it, but they are thinking about adopting one of these COVID passports like statewide. Now, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, on the other hand, has gone entirely in the other direction. Last week, he actually banned them with an executive order in Florida, the vaccine passes. He's arguing there's all kind of privacy implications and, dangers of handing your medical data to some big corporation and liberty issues and stuff that he cited, which I, generally think that's right. Like, I think that was maybe a good move. Now, I should say too, if a private company wants to privately set a rule that, anyone who comes into their establishment has to prove they've been vaccinated, like, I can't overrule that. Who am I to say that they can't do that? But I do still think we should see some of the implications here of doing this. Like, we are talking about basically making all meaningful participation in our society dependent on whether you've received this injection, which is more or less experimental. Like, regardless of how many times you hear that the vaccines are safe from experts, everybody agrees that they were developed way, way faster than most inoculations are, which usually take years to get, to trial and test and get approved. So I don't think in this case you have to be some anti-vaxxer radical to feel a bit iffy about these shots.
Right. And right now, don't they just have FDA emergency approval, and the FDA hasn't given their full approval to the vaccine? So, and Fauci himself, in interviews when asked about what the difference is, there is a difference between the two and how sure they are that the product's safe. This is, I believe for emergency, they just say they're sure that there's not a huge significant amount of side effects that override, the risk of the virus. And he perceives the virus, I believe, to be a huge risk. And so, it could be that, that there are serious side effects from the vaccine and it has emergency FDA approval. There's reasons to be skeptical. That's not, to say that people can't make their own decisions on the vaccine, or that, I'm not trying to say that there's proof that it's dangerous or anything like that.
Right.
just that it only has emergency FDA approval, and that's the status of the three vaccines that they're giving out in the U.S.
Yep, that's right. And ultimately, I do think it should be up to individuals to weigh the risk here and to look into it themselves and figure it out. But creating this passport system would kind of make the decision for them a little bit. Like it would at least propose some pretty extreme consequences if people don't go along in being denied participation in society in many places of society. And not to mention another point here is that, I think many of us who follow the news on COVID have heard many times that the vaccines don't actually guarantee that you won't spread the virus to other people. Like the only thing they're really saying for sure is that you're way less likely to get severely ill from the virus if you get vaccinated. But the question of continued transmission is still kind of open. I don't think they've determined whether you're still able to spread it or not. And that's why they're telling people to, continue wearing masks and social distancing even after you're fully vaccinated. So, from an epidemiological standpoint, these passports might end up being totally pointless. I see a lot of people saying, oh, you should feel a responsibility to protect your fellow man and get vaccinated. But, that might not even be the case. You might still be able to spread the virus even after you get the shot. However, in this case, civil liberties, I think, would be guaranteed to suffer if we move forward on this kind of idea in this system. And some people we've heard in the last week or so vocally demanding that people's freedoms be tied to whether they've received the vaccine. We had this CNN medical analyst, Dr. Lena Wen, saying last week that she's all concerned that there's only a narrow window to pressure people to take the vaccine as a ticket back to their freedom. She said all these states are reopening, and we only have this short period of time to try to coerce people or pressure them to get the vaccine. And she said people's liberties should be used as a carrot to convince them to do this, which to me comes off pretty perverse and Orwellian, and I highly doubt that this medical analyst at CNN is alone in that view. There are a lot of people desperately clamoring for people to get, to tie people's liberties and freedoms to whether they've received the vaccine. And so ultimately, even if this is mostly just a private effort that is developing these apps and stuff, I do think it would significantly make our society, less free, and, basically setting up like a papers, please kind of checkpoint at every business, at every venue, every establishment. And the government is more involved than they want to admit here. But even if they weren't, I think I would still have this position that this is something we should oppose.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. As even just as a libertarian, well, I think we could oppose this even if it's not the government rolling it out. I feel like I've seen quite a few libertarians trying to make that point that, oh, well, as long as it's a private business doing it, then it's not, fascism and totalitarianism and stuff like that. But, in our case, it's pretty clear that the government has an awful lot of influence over the narrative coming out about COVID and everything like that. That it's hard to say and directly say, even, if it's just private businesses deciding to do it, they're not feeling pressure from the government. Also, I'm sure there's, going to be threats from governments as governors and such, as we've already heard, saying that if you people don't lock down or, don't follow the rules of the lockdown, then we're going to have to oppose stricter lockdowns. And so businesses could feel obliged to have to implement these rules because they're saying that, oh, well, if we have any kind of spike in cases, then we're going to have to go back down to 25% capacity dining. And that would be a huge financial blow to all these businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think could be another major incentive on, the private sector. Even if they aren't really wanting to go along with this, there could be many ways. I mean, over the last year, we've seen the, state governments take, I think fairly totalitarian powers over the private sector of shutting down businesses, of telling people, when they're allowed to hug their grandparents or whatever, all kinds of very extreme measures. And in this case, I don't see why this would be any different, from them putting pressure on private businesses to implement these kind of passes.
Right. Dave Smith has said this throughout the lockdown, but he said again on his show, or maybe on the Tom Woods show that he was just on, and that example of I believe Tucker Carlson or somebody from Fox News interviewing the dictator of New Jersey, Murphy. I forget his Governor Murphy's first name. Our friend Joanne Leone calls him Murphy, the friendly dictator. And he was on interview saying that, I wasn't concerned about the First Amendment when we were arresting people attending synagogue.
That's beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, I was just trying to stop the, and so these people not be concerned about your rights and civil liberties. They've already said that they're not when it comes to COVID. This has created quite an interesting firestorm for libertarians. I was very I think Dave Smith really nailed it in this tweet.
Yeah.
He says, this is it. We need to take a stand against COVID passports. Libertarians, if there is a purpose for us existing, then we need to fight this. Anyone good on the left or right should oppose it too. This is some Orwellian nightmare shit. And I think he absolutely nails it, that, you know, this is I think up there with like a war issue, Will, where if you're not good on this, then you're useless as a libertarian. We're talking about possibly the most draconian thing we could face in the U.S. since the Patriot Act, and we absolutely cannot be welcoming that in as libertarians and have to be opposed to it. And we can't be, you know, half and half on the issue either. You know, saying, oh well, you know, it's okay if some private businesses do it, especially since I think the businesses that will adopt it will be big corporations. And so how many people have local grocery stores around them now, to the point where if you're not getting the vaccine passport, are you going to be like forced to do online grocery shopping? You can't go to the grocery store anymore. I think could really start to you know, cause a problem. And also, Will, it's not even just the coronavirus vaccine. You know, if they do this and they claim it's successful, then they may say, well, you know, 100,000 people may die next year of the flu, and so if we force everybody to get flu vaccine and so they could really start to add up using the same exact logic they used for this as to why, you know, we need to expand the vaccine passport, and to the point where we could all be forced to take several inoculations from the government that we may not be comfortable with. And then there are people in separate categories too. People who have like different kind of autoimmune disorders react differently to vaccines. There have been some people that have had severe allergic reactions to the vaccine. I'm not saying that it's like a huge number or anything like that. I'm not trying to get hit with the YouTube censors. I'm just saying those cases do exist. And so, you know, if there are people who could be in higher risk groups, how do you get those kind of exemptions? And you know, there's just so much going on here, Will, where you could really create a second class system. We'll get into Israel a little bit more coming up, but this is a point that I've been making on the show for several months now, because we've essentially seen this rolling out in Israel, where they vaccinated the, you know, mostly white Jewish population, the Israeli citizens first, and then all the Palestinians. I think they've gotten like maybe a few thousand vaccines, like tens of thousands of vaccines, but not a significant number. And so now I was, you know, looking at a story about how like a mother who was in Gaza couldn't see her children for Mother's Day because nobody's vaccinated, so they can't travel through. Israel's posing like I think they call it a green pass system. I don't know, maybe it's evolving. I haven't followed it completely, but they are imposing a system for people who are fully vaccinated to be able to be out in public more than the rest of the population. And so this is effectively a way to keep the Palestinians from being able to go, you know, they didn't name them Jewish only zones, but it's essentially creating that two-tiered system. And so it's very easy to see how this system could be used and abused that way. And even if you're not, if you're like, the COVID vaccine is fine, I think everybody should take it, understand that you're setting up a potential here for a real apartheid nightmare.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know, the Israelis have adopted a few things that are very alarming in terms of their COVID response. They not only have that green pass thing that you mentioned, that's the same kind of idea of a vaccine passport, but they also have these things that are calling freedom bracelets for people who are new arrivals to Israel or travelers who are returning to the country, where they make them wear this tracking device basically that monitors them and makes sure they don't break quarantine. And that device is developed by this company Supercomp, and guess what they develop? Guess what like industry they work in? The prisoner tracking monitoring industry. So that's, you know, that's who they're contracting with here. And I do see similar trends here picking up in the US of these like frightening public private partnerships that are, it's not the free market. So like, I think that's an important point to stress as well.
Well, getting into this a little bit more while we're on this topic, kind of, the Libertarian Party of Kentucky had a quite a tweet that got a lot of reaction, and I have some issues with the tweet maybe, but overall I don't see it as being as problematic as people made. The Libertarian Party of Kentucky, if people haven't seen it yet, are the vaccine passports going to be yellow, shaped like a star, and sewn onto our clothes? Referring to the what the Jewish people were put through in Nazi Germany. Now, I guess I don't see this as being the most accurate comparison. Well, Dave Smith has been saying, and I think he's more right about this, that it's more close to like kind of the Chinese credit system with like the
Yes.
phone app kind of data and stuff like that, and where it's not as serious as being labeled a Jew in Nazi Germany. I don't think they're going to start rounding up the people who aren't vaccinated and throwing them into gas chambers. However,
Right.
they are potentially going to start losing access to parts of the community, right? Because of their decision not to get vaccinated. Also, now being out here in Colorado, there's a lot of like federal and state lands out here. And
Yeah.
so, who says that, parts that they have enclosures and stuff like that, they have like closed-in bathrooms and everything. Like, who's going to be able to use those kind of facilities are things that may start to come up if they say, like anybody on federal lands or using a federal facility has to, be vaccinated and have the vaccine passport, whatever like that. Um, there's just a lot of ways that this could get nasty. But I want to let you talk about that tweet.
Yeah, yeah. Like, so I kind of agree with you. Like, man, I'm so sick of Nazi and Holocaust and Hitler references after the last 4 years. Like, I just think they're played out. They're a little bit lazy intellectually. But I don't think like the outrage and the backlash to that tweet was so ridiculous and dishonest that like a lot of it is the very same people who've been making nonstop Nazi and Hitler and Holocaust comparisons under Trump. These are the same people who are now up in arms. How dare you say that about, the Holocaust? How dare you compare anything to the Holocaust? That's ridiculous. Again, like I do tend to think it's kind of intellectually lazy to have to invoke the Holocaust, but nonetheless, like I think they make some kind of good point that like we are talking about closing off a large segment of public space to a certain segment of people. And it's certainly, yes, it's very different to attach that to someone's like heritage or religion or ethnicity. It's very different from tying it to vaccines. But nonetheless, there's some kernel of a comparison there that I think they could make. It's a little unfortunate that the way they made it and the way they did that kind of, I think, distracted from the issue a little bit. I saw Dave Smith had this long conversation with a rabbi that over this whole issue. And the rabbi, I think, made a couple decent points about how maybe this did kind of distract and maybe this isn't the best comparison to use. But nonetheless, I don't think it was anti-Semitic or offensive in that way. I think that's sort of dishonest and just I don't know, a bad argument.
Right. Yeah. You get a little bit of the same reaction when anybody compares something to the Holocaust. I think there's very few comparisons that really make sense to compare something to Nazi Germany and stuff like that. And so, yeah, and to use a more accurate comparison, like the Chinese party social credit kind of system or something like that. But I think this is kind of like a whole new Orwellian type of situation we're dealing with, and to try to like fit it into like something that happened in a different time in history is going to be hard to do because it's just a completely new thing that we're talking about here. I
That's right.
did see some good tweets from Justin Amash here. He's one of the most prominent political libertarians, and he's taken a strong stand against the vaccine passports. And I want to give credit to him for that because at times I've kind of picked on Justin Amash for maybe not being the most strong and forth, libertarian. Will, anything else on these vaccine passports? I'm of course we'll continue to update it, and some of the technology that they could involve and roll out in here. Will, talking about like facial recognition to be able to identify who has a vaccine passport. People who have the passport will probably see that maybe as convenient, right? You don't have to
Right.
whip out your phone and hold it up, and and then of course too, something just talking, people say how hard it is to get like have an ID to be able to vote. I mean, if you're
Right.
talking about having a phone app, then you have to be able to have a smartphone, which I mean, I do understand that in some states, like the paperwork barrier to gain an ID could actually be pretty difficult, especially with this real ID thing. And then
Sure.
even more so for women who have had like name changes and stuff, like, more likely to get married and everything. You got to be able to prove all those documents, marriage papers, divorce papers, and all that. So I can understand, like, maybe in certain cases it could be more difficult, but at the same time, as far as like being like poor and being restrictive in that sense goes, having to have a phone capable of, running an app, and then also maybe barriers for people who are elderly or just technology limited. Like not everybody's grandma could use an iPhone. Most people, I guess, probably do, but just all these sections of the population that are going to have more trouble if we do try to really unroll something like this. Will, anything? Yeah.
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback on that, it is kind of interesting to see the opposition to this, or excuse me, the support for this from the very same people who are so fervently opposed to like voter ID and stuff. Which, as you said, that's not something I'm necessarily in favor of. Maybe that is sort of an overly onerous restriction. But geez, if that's an onerous restriction, then what would you describe this as? Like it's kind of a weird thing that they make this distinction. They support one and oppose the other. But overall, no, I don't. I think we covered most of the stuff on the fax passes. I would like to. I think some of the stuff that I want to start looking into, like I said, there's at least 17 of these that are under development. I want to start looking into specifically what this technology is. I haven't seen much reporting on like the actual specific apps and what they're going to do and what they're going to track. And so that's sort of the next thing that I would like to look into.
Right, especially as it says in the Washington Post article, the Biden administration is trying to corral it. 17 seems like far too many. Like not
Yeah.
everybody's gonna have an entire page of iPhone apps for whenever you're trying to go to like different places
Yeah.
to use your different passports. So I'm guessing that we're gonna end up with two, three, maybe five or something. It's not going to be very many. It'll maybe be geographical a little bit. Like everybody in the Northeast, New England will use like one app, but I don't see us having like 19 or something, 17, 19 apps.
Right, right. And the last thing I'll say too is like the CDC is going to play a role in which ones are ultimately used. They're going to act sort of as an accreditation agency. So the federal government will be the ones deciding
There you
ultimately
go.
which ones we see and use. So
So the last thing I want to mention on COVID, Will, is that I really am not taking a position here on the podcast of whether anybody should get the vaccine or not, or
yes,
vaccine good, bad, not my take. I'm talking specifically about the vaccine passports. I try
yes,
to be empathetic to people who want the vaccine. I understand that there's people who live with their grandparents or elderly parents. You want the vaccine because you want to feel more comfortable that you're not going to bring that home. That's absolutely okay. I understand why people are skeptical of the vaccine and don't want to take it, either for historical reasons, dealing with some of the medical malpractice that has happened on systematic government huge levels in the US, or
right.
because you
Tuskegee.
have or any of the other ones.
Yeah, there's more.
There's a long list, but that would be maybe the most famous. But then also going to just feeling like you personally may be susceptible to an allergic reaction or something like that, and so not taking a stand on any of that. Just because I feel like this is the kind of video that could get flagged or taken down. It will be up at Odyssey no matter what. I'm not worried about being taken down there if you can't find it at YouTube. But I do want to point out, Will, that a couple weeks ago, two people from MSNBC, Joyanne Reed, retweeted this, and Ferdinand Artemini, I don't know how to say his name.
Armandi, is that it?
Armandi,
Armand?
probably, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Tweeted out this picture. Today's center of the COVIDiots universe in Miami Beach, Florida, and it's a bunch of people there. Apparently, this is a picture from 2019. Not that I'm sure that there aren't plenty of people out in Florida, which is one of the most open states, walking around gathering without masks, right? Like,
Sure.
that is happening, and she actually posted a bunch of other pictures that didn't. People, I probably did reverse image search and didn't find that it was from 2019 or before.
Right.
But and this wasn't the correct thing, and yet it gets left up. It's from the 21st, and this is what, 2 weeks later. Well, and so it seems very selective in what they decide to censor and what they decide not to.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
So, Will, we talked a little bit about what was happening in Israel with the COVID thing, and that's something that I've really tried to keep up on the show because it just seems like one of the most terrible things, right? That it's in the US, we're so focused on the demographics of who's getting the vaccine or not, and yet there's so much praise for the Israeli vaccination program, and yet there's so much demographic disparity between who's getting the vaccines and not. And you would think maybe that would come up as the U.S. is now releasing some human rights and reports on Israel, but it looks like they're just doubling down on all the old Trump policies. Will, what's going on with this?
Yeah, so the State Department last week issued, as you said, this big report on human rights around the world. It hit on all kinds of different issues in all kinds of different countries. But yeah, just to sort of hone in on the section on Israel, there are a few interesting things here that I think kind of reflect on U.S. policy toward that country. And the first thing to say, yes, there I don't believe was any mention about the sort of you used a good phrase, the demographic disparity of the vaccine distribution in Israel proper and inside the occupied territories, where the Palestinians are largely under at the mercy of the Israeli state and the Israeli military, that they don't really govern their own affairs. They have sort of this thing in the West Bank called the Palestinian Authority, but even that is very much beholden to the Israeli power. So yeah, no, I don't believe there's much mention of that in there. However, there's a couple other things about sort of U.S. policies toward Israel that this report hit on. So in this section, they say, very matter of factly that the U.S. has not only recognized Jerusalem as the true capital of Israel, but also has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is territory that Israel stole from Syria during the Six-Day War in 1967. And then later, about a decade later, they then officially annexed it. I think in 1981, they made it, they claimed it as their own actual territory. It's not just an occupied place. And Donald Trump broke with pretty long-standing U.S. policy to recognize the Israeli claim over Golan. And the same goes for moving our embassy to Jerusalem and accepting that as the eternal, unbroken, undivided capital of Israel, or whatever crap they said there. And that the Jerusalem decision was pretty controversial because the Palestinians have all kinds of historical and religious ties to that city. They still live there, but they've kind of been like corralled into East Jerusalem. And even in East Jerusalem, the Israelis build settlements there. They've kind of been, the Palestinians have sort of been penned in. So it appears in this report, just in the language of it, that the Biden administration is sort of reaffirming these two policies in this, this human rights report, backing the Israeli claims over Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, which were both controversially pushed under Trump. The international community has sort of come out against both of these decisions and opposed it. And I mean, this doesn't come as a huge shock from the Biden administration. We did have a campaign official back in November saying that he had no plan. Biden has no plans to reverse Trump's stance on the Golan. The Secretary of State under Biden, Anthony Blinken, kind of waffled. He was asked about the Golan last month. He said that, like, legal questions aside, like, refused to sort of endorse the sovereignty claim, but nonetheless said that, the Golan is a very, very important to Israeli security. So very much echoed the sort of Israeli line there, 100%. Now, another thing, the human rights report under Biden, it omits any use of the term occupied territories in the title, which broke with previous administrations. They had used that phrase right in the title of the report, Israel and the occupied territories. Instead, this is, I think, says Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, something like that. And the Biden administration has, continued the Trump policy of not mentioning the occupied territories in the title. However, they do use that phrase in the text of the report itself. They refer a couple times to the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. So in a very small way, they broke with the Trump administration on that. But beyond that, this report very much pulls its punches. Like, it barely even gets into the issues of Israeli settlements in the occupied territories, which are, very important. We've talked about on the show before. The settlements may make any possible two-state solution impossible. It might make that not a doable thing because you have so many settlements built up all along the West Bank. They divide it up, and it becomes very hard to ever, determine who controls what. It's just like this total mess. Now, the Biden administration, during press briefings later on, when they were being asked about this report, State Department people were sort of less direct about talking about the occupied territories. They seemed like they really wanted to avoid using that phrase, even as they were asked about it. However, a few days later, the main State Department spokesperson, Ned Price, he was eventually pressured into saying that, yes, we do agree the West Bank is occupied. So, under pressure, they did finally acknowledge this directly, but it was kind of like pulling teeth to get them to do it. And I don't know. Overall, this report does not inspire very much confidence that Biden's going to be trying to pursue any different policies from his predecessor, from Trump. There's a couple little things they changed with the language, but it mostly sounds like they don't want to rock the boat. They just kind of want to coast off of the previous administration.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a lot of what's been going on during the Biden administration so far on foreign policy. Will is, despite running as I'm going to be different than Trump, it's been very similar, including on the Israel issue. Although there is some effort, I guess, to have some rhetoric to appease people who are more human rights oriented, and so again, you may get like I think Michael F. Brown at the Electronic Intifada writes, State Department buries Israeli occupation in word salad, where they say a little bit of everything, kind of about the Israel situation, where it's about their security, but it's also, we're concerned about the human right, and so it ends up meaning absolutely nothing to the Palestinians,
Yeah.
and just greenlighting the continued U.S. support for the occupation of Palestine, which is significant. Part of the reason why, this is so concerning to me. I honestly probably not that interested in how most countries are rolling out their vaccine programs. But Israel's a certain example because the U.S. gives them so much aid, does so much to prop up what Israel is doing. And then the international institutions that are in place to condemn these kind of actions, like at the UN or something like that, the U.S. puts a lot of our effort and political, geopolitical, capital that we have into making sure nobody is able to condemn Israel for what they're doing to the Palestinians.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we saw how like a lot of, I mean, like the U.S. government under Barack Obama, there was one vote where I think it was condemning settlements in the UN Security Council. The Obama administration didn't even vote for it; they just abstained. And the reaction to that, like, oh my God, how could you betray us? Like, there's just an insane amount of pressure, huge Israel lobby to back up all that U.S. support.
Yep. All right. Well, where are we going next?
Yeah, yeah. So if we're all wrapped up with the Israel report here, the human rights report, I know you had a few stories about Iran you wanted to talk about. I think the big thing this week was there was an offer for indirect talks in Vienna next week of possibly starting to revive the nuclear deal. But I know there's a little more than that. So you can start wherever you want here on Iran. Is there any chance of progress on this deal, or jump in wherever you'd like?
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and start with some of the things that have been occurring over the past week. I think the biggest one is Iran and China agreeing to a 25-year cooperation agreement.
Yeah.
And we're not exactly sure of what all the details are, but they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in investment from China into Iran, extending the Belt and Road initiatives and stuff like that. So I think that it is kind of was maybe a signal to the U.S. that the maximum pressure campaign really wasn't going to work, because I think this project is kind of ensuring that China is not going to play ball with the U.S. sanctions on Iran, and that they're a big enough economy that if they buy a lot of Iranian oil, then the U.S. sanctions really aren't going to work. And so I think that was probably a signal there. Then we had Iran's president saying that he wasn't seeing any serious effort from the Biden administration to extend the nuclear deal. We had the U.S. extending the sanctions waiver to Iran to be able to continue to buy electricity from Iran. And so I think this is another example, Will, of a clear example to everybody involved that the maximum pressure campaign isn't going to work when the governments that the U.S. literally built a decade and a half ago and has some of the most influence over than we could have of any government in the world, with the amount of military aid that we supply and just general aid that we supply to Iraq. Even though they do want us to leave that, we do have a lot of influence over that government, and they're continuing to buy Iranian oil because they have no other option. So it's clear that the sanctions campaign isn't quite working. Iran also added their fourth cluster of advanced centrifuges. These are IR-2M machines at the underground Natanz facility, and I believe they're planning 6 of these clusters in total. And this is allowing Iran to enrich more nuclear fuel, and this is something that they could use in their reactors, or they could sell. It could be a very, profitable to sell if other countries are able to buy it. The U.S. does sanction Iran to prevent them from exporting this enriched uranium. If they were to get back within the nuclear deal, they would have to unload a lot of the nuclear fuel that they have. And so that's kind of leading up to this past week when we got this signal after, I believe, Iran met with the other parties of the Iran nuclear deal. That would be Germany, France, Britain, the UK, Britain is the UK, China, and Russia, and all of those countries met, and then the U.S. said that they're going to engage in indirect talks with Iran in Vienna. I believe, Will, that those will actually be taking part this week. That last week they were planned for this week, possibly starting on Tuesday. Now, Iran ruled out face-to-face talks because it's been the Iranian position all along, Will, that that they're not going to engage in talks with the U.S. while the U.S. broke a deal and still has sanctions on Iran. But the two sides do need to be able to communicate kind of what they're thinking could possibly happen over the next month or two. And so hopefully the ideas of what the U.S. wants to do and what Iran wants to do line up enough to take steps in the right direction. It seems like representatives from several countries have been involved, in talking with both sides. There's this great article by Trita Parsi at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It's titled U.S.-Iran Meeting in Vienna Signals New Hope for the JCPOA. And, he's talking about how he's encouraged about these potential talks. One of the quotes that he singled out was from the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who said that he thought that the talks could net something positive. And so if Lavrov is saying that, then the Russians would be more likely to understand the Iranian positions in this talk, and they're signaling that something positive could happen, then maybe something positive could happen here. And then we also had the New York Times saying that the U.S. will not seek to retain sanctions as leverage against Iran, I guess, for anything other than getting back in the nuclear deal. Now, today we did have a statement from the Iranian foreign ministry, not from the foreign minister himself, but from their spokesperson. And it's being reported in Western media, at least, by saying that Iran rejects step-by-step lifting of U.S. sanctions. I'm not exactly sure what this means, what Iran will agree to or not. If they are willing to take a couple of steps to get things moving in the right direction, where the U.S. starts to lift a significant amount of sanctions, and maybe in return, Iran doesn't switch on their next cascade of centrifuges. Right. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that could happen here, I suppose, but that is being reported today. So I think that gets us about caught up as well as I can. Well, of course, a lot of what's going on here is behind the scenes, and right, sometimes it's important for these things to unfold behind the scenes because countries take hardline positions for their own populations. And so maybe the Iranian position is softer behind the scenes, maybe the U.S. position is softer behind the scenes. We can only hope that they could find some way to get back into this deal, because this deal takes war between the U.S. and Iran essentially off of the table. There's an international body that is respectable enough that if it says Iran isn't making nuclear weapons, it would be really difficult for another country to go and carry out an attack against Iran and claim that they have nuclear weapons that the IAEA is saying they don't. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. Yeah, it's also interesting to see sort of the parallels between when Iran initially came to the table with the Obama administration to negotiate this deal. A lot of, I think, American hawks will make it sound like, oh yeah, it was the American pressure that brought Iran to the table. However, I think we've mentioned on the show a few times it was more Iranian pressure that seemed to bring the Americans to the table in their developing of centrifuges and stuff, things that were sort of unsettling to the U.S. administration. And now I think we're seeing sort of a similar thing here with, it's not the American pressure that's bringing the Iranians Iranians to the table. It's this deal with China. It's the, the inevitable, obvious continued dependence of Iraq on Iran that, like, we can't really tamper with that too much. And so it's almost like these other, as much as the U.S. would like to be the master of the universe and control everything by its own dictate, it's not that, there are other considerations here, and that Iran and other powers can have a say in this.
Right. Yeah, it's this interesting thing that everybody, especially when it comes to the U.S. government, assumes that when it points and says something, that everybody is going to fall in line at least enough to make it worth the way the U.S. says, and it almost never works out that way. Will. I don't know if you have anything else on the Iran issue. I think that's all I had. Hopefully next week, well, we could come back on the show and say, hey, we're making our first steps, or at least, both sides came out and said that they think something positive came out of it, especially because we're 2 to 3 months away now from Iranian elections. And if Iran isn't back within the deal and lets a hardliner, who knows that they even end up being interested in getting back in the deal. Initially, when this thing was negotiated, people pretend like it was such a giveaway to the Iranians, but the Iranian hardliners were not, by and large, in support of it. And so, and they had to be kind of corralled into it, some of the Republican hardliners in the U.S. And so if they end up getting elected, it could be like, getting a Trump type figure on the other side who's just like, no, we're not going to do this deal. So, we got a lot of interesting things coming up here.
Yeah, so we're kind of there is a window here that this can, that there's any potential for this to happen. Like you're saying, if there's that potential for a hardliner to come to power. But yeah, just switching gears a little bit. Another, long running news thread we've been covering on the show for years now is Afghanistan. The war there, the American occupation, especially last year's deal with the Taliban to withdraw by May 1st. Now, it doesn't look like that's happening at this point. This May 1st withdrawal deadline, Biden said it's going to be very hard to meet that. And now I think we have Biden asking for some kind of extension on the U.S. presence there. I'm honestly a little bit behind on some of the Afghanistan news. So, start with that, or start wherever you think is best to begin with the updates there this week.
Yeah, so there's not a whole lot on this, Will, but it does look like, at least for being reported by Tolo News, the write-up here is by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Report, U.S. asks Taliban to extend May 1st withdrawal deadline, and citing sources closest to the Taliban, Afghanistan's Tolo News report, the Biden administration has asked the Taliban to agree to a continued U.S. presence in Afghanistan for 3 or 6 months past May 1st. The May 1st withdrawal deadline was set by the U.S. Taliban peace agreement that was signed in Doha last year. So, it hasn't looked like for the past few weeks now that the U.S. was going to get out on May 1st, but they're asking for 3 to 6 months, and so it doesn't even sound like they're in a huge hurry to leave. That's, the concerning part to me. If they were like, talking to the Taliban and saying like, 30 to 60 days or something like that, we're trying to pack up everything and get out of here. The last guy was just a doofus who didn't plan for this thing, so now I got the really uncomfortable logistic problem of, it was such a pain in the ass to get all this stuff in here. How the hell do I get it back out? You guys understand I need an extra month or two, but they're asking for an extra 6 months. So that seems like they're just looking to extend the war. Now the issue here is that the Taliban have said in the past that they will attack any troops, Western foreign troops who remain in Afghanistan past May 1st. I'm not sure, again, maybe they're willing to be somewhat flexible with that May 1st deadline. Are they going to be 6 months flexible and wait till November 1st for the U.S. to then maybe get out? I kind of doubt it. But we haven't had an official response from the Taliban on that. The other update I had on Afghanistan, and the article didn't load up for me here, but anyways, Afghanistan's President Ghani introduced his peace process. It's a 3-step plan he has here, and the first step is a ceasefire and a deal with the Taliban. The second step is elections, and then the third step will be crafting a new Afghan constitution. This isn't the same order as the American plan will, where it sounds like the American plan would dissolve the government and then there would be a constitutional referendum. It tied in with elections is kind of the way it sounded to me.
Yeah.
And this plan is, kind of, well, the ceasefire agreement first and then elections. I see the big problem being the ceasefire and the agreement. Just being able to get done, and then how long will it take to be able to set up elections in Afghanistan, especially if you're looking to hold elections in all the Taliban held areas of the country. I'm sure
Yeah.
there's going to be all kinds of questions about, who's monitoring these sites. Is it the Taliban that's going to be providing this security? Are they going
Right.
to let, are Afghan soldiers going to go out into the tribal lands of the Helmand province and,
Yeah.
stand guard? There's a lot of complicated things that I'm guessing need to be worked out before the Afghan government is able to hold elections for the entire, outlined region of Afghanistan, if
Right.
that is even a real state that could exist. But well, we had this really interesting situation in Afghanistan, and this is the only real point I wanted to make on this today was you have probably the least powerful person in all these negotiations. I mean, America's the military and financial power, the Taliban are the ground power, and where does that leave the Afghan government? And yet, because of his like kind of official title as the internationally recognized government, the government that's backed by the US, even though it would fall apart without all the US funding, this guy ends up with a lot of power to dictate what might happen in Afghanistan. And the Kabul government is just loaded up with the old warlords. And I cast a very nasty characters, Dostum and Hetmachar.
Yeah.
um
Northern Lions. Yeah.
Right, right. So it's just very interesting how the U.S. Intervention in Afghanistan ends up, now with this guy Ghani having so much power to dictate what's happening in the country, and yet his army is falling apart and can't exist, and yet the U.S. has to keep propping him up so we don't look like we failed.
Yeah, that's right. I've seen that Ashraf Ghani has come out before and very vocally opposed to any idea of dissolving the government, that, this threatens his own personal power. I think that's a big factor here. I think that's overall just a factor with the Afghan government. Like you said, it fully is dependent on American largesse. And so there's a lot of people who've kind of been propped up in these positions and, they're looking at the idea of a withdrawal or any kind of peace process, and that could threaten their power and finances and influence and all that. So that's been a factor in all this. And then when it comes to the American, a request for an extension, like 6 months, I don't know. Once we look at this list, this tall list of things that, like you outlined, all the things they want to do, a ceasefire, new elections, reshuffling the Afghan constitution, I could see that being an excuse to stay much longer than 6 months. This is a very big project they're embarking on. And I can see them saying that even if we have diplomats or something in the country to do this, we have to have some kind of force protection there. And, I can see this being an excuse to stay longer than 6 months. And so this is, I think, very concerning to see them requesting even that.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. Well, Will, anything else?
That's it, man. I think we covered all the bases here.
All right, everybody. What do we got to plug here? Well, check out the sponsor, Paloma Verde, of course. Check out all the social media pages, Twitter at con_interest, Facebook, and then the MeWe page. I think we get maybe the most traction right now on the MeWe page. We're over 300 followers or subscribers or whatever they're called on there. So if you're interested, check out that. And then Twitter and Facebook as well. On Twitter, he's at the Will Porter. I'm at Kyle Anslone _. Video versions of the show up at YouTube and at Odyssey. Be sure to check out the Odyssey. I think YouTube is going to increase the censorship in the coming months. I think it's only a matter of time before at least some of the best episodes from our favorite podcasts start disappearing from the site, if not
Yeah.
the podcast altogether. So think about alternatives, and I think Odyssey offers the most unique platform with the content being tokenized and being easy to donate cryptos and having its own crypto system. And then Libertarian Institute, Will's got the shirt on. You get yourself some
Yeah.
swag.
I
I
say
got
go check it out.
Right above my head here, I got my signed copy of Enough Already, Skyhorn's new book. You get yourself one of those at the Libertarian Institute. You can also check out a bunch of great articles. Later this week, we'll have on Libertarian Institute writers Connor Freeman and Patrick McFarlane. So be sure to check out that site and everything that we're doing. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back with another show on Wednesday.
See you, everybody.